Exploration, exchange, and encounter of the Little Rock Nine.
Exploration. The action of traveling in or through an unfamiliar area in order to learn about it.
Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957.
Central High School, like most high schools in the South during this time, was exclusively populated by Caucasian students.
Civil rights activists had been working all over the South to integrate public transportation and common areas such as restaurants and theaters.
They began to push boundaries and explore where else integration could be possible.
The exploration of integration in schools was led by civil rights pioneer Daisy Bates.
She found African American students with the highest test scores at the black high school and asked them to join her in her fight for racial equality in the education system.
These 9 brave Arkansas teenagers broke through racial barriers to become the first black students to attend Little Rock High School.
In the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, segregation in schools had been deemed unconstitutional. However, no one had been daring enough to push the social boundary.
When the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, got word of this, he called in the National Guard to turn away the African American teens on the first day of school.
Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community.
Faubus claimed this action was to protect the students when in reality he was trying to ensure the votes of pro-segregationists to win the next election.
Sure enough, when they showed up for their first day of school, they were greeted by furious protesters in the National Guard who quickly turned them away.
While the 9 students were forced to stay home, photos of the line of soldiers and wild protesters shocked the country.
President Eisenhower heard about the conflict and took action. He met with Governor Faubus and warned him not to go against the Supreme Court ruling.
Then on September 24th, Eisenhower took federal control of the National Guard in Arkansas and ordered them to protect the 9 African American students at the school.
The protesters were still relentless, and many pulled their own children out of the school, but the Little Rock Nine safely arrived and left school each day.
The actions taken by Daisy Bates and the 9 African American teenagers to explore integration enabled the possibility for all students in America to receive an equal education. Counter: unexpectedly experience or be faced with something difficult or hostile.
The black students knew they could face white supremacists on their first day, but never expected the huge enraged mob that waited for them outside of school.
White parents and their children verbally assaulted the African American students in hopes to try to discourage them from their task.
Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9 students, recalled, "They moved closer and closer. Somebody started yelling. I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the crowd, someone who could maybe help. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face, but when I looked again, she spat on me."
The National Guard of Arkansas was also present at Central High School on September 4th, 1957, to push away the black students.
The other big encounter was the conflict that Eisenhower had with the people of the United States. He was appalled by the malicious actions of the white protesters and the Arkansas governor who went against the Supreme Court ruling.
The President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. For a few minutes this evening, I should like to speak to you about the serious situation that has arisen in Little Rock. To make this talk, I have come to the President's office in the White House. I could have spoken from Rhode Island, where I have been staying recently. But I felt that, in speaking from the house of Lincoln, of Jackson, and of Wilson, my words would better convey both the sadness I feel in the action I was compelled today to make.
In a speech, he addressed the segregationalists as an embarrassment to the nation.
The encounter between the segregationalists and the African American students showed the hateful nature of the Southern people towards other races.
Eisenhower's encounter with the Southern people showed that the racist behavior would no longer be tolerated.
Through these encounters, the U.S. citizens began to see the merging between social and racial groups in the South. Exchange, an act of giving one thing and receiving another. After the events in Little Rock, An exchange of views about integration and an exchange of inspiration for civil rights leaders swept the South. Southerners began to see that racism will no longer be taken lightly. The South had the misconception that they were untouchable by law. Eisenhower showed that if their segregation interfered with federal law, then it would be stopped with force.
Nation in which laws, not men, are supreme.
There were still quite a few racists who hated the black children going to the school, but many of the white students and their parents either accepted or tolerated these colored individuals eventually. Another exchange was the transition of inspiration for African American leaders to fight for integration. Protesters fought hard and were willing to die for social and racial equality, not only for themselves but for future generations to come. Historians also believe that the Little Rock Nine inspired African Americans to integrate with less fear and to protest because they saw young students having the courage to do so. The exchanges that occurred proved to U.S. citizens that the federal government triumphs over petty racism and that rights and equality for African Americans was possible. The courageous steps taken by the Little Rock Nine had helped open doors for education for African Americans all across the nation. The disappearance of the mob, protest slogans, and the sight of children laughing and shouting normally as they waited on the corner for their bus showed that racial equality was possible and coming. The exploration, exchange, and encounter that occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 shaped the U.S. school systems today and helped with racial equality.